My name is Forrest Morton Bird, B-I-R-D, and I was born in Stoughton, Massachusetts on June 9th, 1921.
Were you born in a home or a hospital?
I was born at home, as like, of course, so many at that time.
And what kind of home did your family live in those days?
My family had a home that was probably about 3 years old, and my mom and my father were married just immediately. They'd been going together, and of course he went off to war. And when he came back, they were married, and I was the first born, and then I had a sister who was born about 5 years later.
Can we go back a little bit, like your family heritage? Where's your family from, like in Europe or way back there?
Sure. As far as my family was concerned, my mom was a strict Irish Catholic girl, and my dad was English, strictly English background, about fourth generation, well, fifth generation, I guess, in this country, and but they got along very well. They never had any problems related. My dad was a Mason, had gone through all the chairs of Masonry and so on, but I never ever remember anything that was a problem in the family. We all had to go to Sunday school and church and so on, so that it worked out well.
Did you have a relationship with your grandparents at all?
Yes, my granddaddy, gosh, he was born just after the Civil War, I guess, right in that area.
What was his name?
Henry Bird. Henry Bird. He was a carpenter, actually, and a cabinet maker. In fact, they built their own home, I think, probably about 1882 or something in Stoughton, Massachusetts. It was a big home, still standing today, in fact. And I was very close to both grandmas, and they were very, very nice to me.
But what was your grandparents' names on your mother's side?
My mother's side, she was, I used to call her Gaga all the way through. Anne was her name, yeah. And Ethel was the other one, my father's mother.
People have different names for their grandparents, don't you? Every kid's...
Oh, they sure do. Gaga and so on, and then Grandma, and you know, everywhere. And not so much for Grandpa, but as you know, for Grandma, there was all kinds.
And were they city-type folks, or?
No, they were country folks. In other words, at that time it was all country around there, and they raised just about everything they ate. And of course they had 2 horses at that time, and I can remember just about everybody in our neighborhood. There were farms, probably about 250 acres, kind of farms. Most of them were dairy farms. And these were Polish and Lithuanian families that had migrated to the United States. Very, very hard-working people. And we all knew each other very well and got along well, especially during the Depression, because one family depended on the other. But we did, all of us, raise just about everything we ate. So consequently, I can remember my mom liked flowers, my dad liked the garden. And I knew gardening as soon as I could identify weeds. You know what I did.
Can you tell us your mother's full name, if you know when she was born and where, and then tell us what she looked like?
Okay. My mom was, oh boy, height probably, she was dark-haired, and probably, I'd say, 5'9", probably 5'10", right around in there. And she was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And her dad had been killed in a railroad accident, Boston and Maine Railroad. Earlier, 2 locomotives came together, and so I guess it was fog and bad conditions and so on. And I don't remember him. He actually died before I was born.
What was her full name?
My mother's name? Jane Weeks Bird, B-I-R-D, yeah. Okay.
And did she have brothers and sisters?
No, she was an only child.
And what was her personality like when you really...
She was a fighting Irish gal. She was. She had a pretty good temper. I'm glad I didn't. My dad was easygoing, but my mom was a typical Irish gal. But they got along wonderfully well. And she was a great homekeeper. And she used to love to refinish furniture and so on. I can remember, even at that time, everything in the house was antique. Don't lean back, you know, and be careful of that. But she would take and get stuff and refinish it and upholster it. She was meticulous that way, and that was our hobby. And we all benefited, of course, by it, because we did have very, very nice furnishings in our home. Our home was actually a 200-year-old colonial home that had all been modernized about 1927. and it was really, really comfortable. And in the center of the home, there was a block of fireplaces. There was 4 fireplaces that opened into each room. It all surrounded it right there. And I can remember the library where I always studied and so on. And on the mantelpiece, it had "Hark to the Cheery Voices of the Dancing Flames" carved in a maple mantelpiece. And I always remember we have a warm fire going and so on. And we had a coal fire, hot water in the basement, but during the winter the fireplace was going almost all the time. And of course we had lots of oak wood that we would cut and keep in the cellar. I know I was a good piler and so on that. So it was I had a nice home life, really did.
Now your father, could you tell us his full name and where he was born? And
Morton Forrest Bird. In other words, they reversed it. In other words, he was Morton Forrest and I was Forrest Morton. And he was born in Stoughton, Massachusetts in 1882. And born there and grew up there and so on, went to school in Boston. But basically, he was really good with physics and math. So I was very fortunate. My mom was an English major, so I couldn't go too far wrong. In other words, everything was based on that. So
did he have brothers and sisters?
my dad had 2 brothers. And Al was probably, let's say, 5 years older, and his younger brother Harold was 5 years younger.
Did you know them very well?
Oh, very well. They were all very, very nice to me.
Now, how did your parents meet?
I don't know, to be honest with you. They met before World War I, and I really don't know.
They didn't really talk about their...
Well, it may have. I was probably interested, or I didn't pay attention, probably, yeah.
Now, do you know where they got married or anything like that?
Yeah, they got married in Stoughton, Massachusetts, yeah.
And how do you spell Stoughton?
Stoughton.
And where's that in conjunction to like Boston?
It's 18 miles south of Boston. Now there's a Stoughton, Wisconsin. That's the only other one, and they make truck bodies and so on there. So that, but Stoughton, Massachusetts, is very, very old. It's one of the founding towns around there.
It's a real colonial type of.
It's really colonial. Of course, it's changed in more recent years, but basically in those years it really was colonial. Yeah.
What's your earliest memories of growing up as a kid? What was life like for you when you were like 5 years old?
I guess the first thing I remember, I was just about 4.5, 5 years old, or I must have been the age of remembrance. In the 4th of July, of course, we always had torpedoes. They were like candy kisses and wrapped up, and you threw them and bang. Well, I took one of them unbeknown. I don't know where I got it because my family was pretty good, so I couldn't get it. But I picked it up, and I did that against the window. And of course, I went through the window, but boy, I tore up the palmar index of my hand, but it all recovered. So I guess that's the first thing I can really remember.
Now, did you have brothers and sisters?
I had one sister 5 years younger than I am. Yeah.
Now, were you an inside kid or outside kid?
I was outside.
And what did you have friends in the neighborhood? Or?
No, I didn't. I was kind of a loner because we didn't have. Gosh, I guess the nearest boy my age was probably several miles away, and we weren't close. But I was kind of alone. My dad had a great machine shop, and I learned to build things, and he would help me. He was a great daddy. He really was.
So you spent a lot of time with him when you were...
Yes, I did. He involved me in everything. He was a great teacher and showed me a way of life, I guess, more than anything else. But he did teach me to use my head and my hands. And especially, he had a real good machine shop where he used to make stuff. So he had lathes and milling machines and drill presses and so on. And I guess my first thing I did pretty much alone, he guided me a little bit, was homemade tractors out of Model T Fords.
What gave you that idea?
The farmers all had Fordson tractors. They probably bought in 27, 28. And of course, during the Depression, they didn't have any money to buy anything. And they had ensilage. That came in about 1929 or 30. They would raise corn and grind it up and put it in these big silos to feed these mostly dairy cows, and I guess increase the milk production or something. But anyhow, they had to grind that up. So they had horses, of course, that worked out in the fields and brought it in. But the Fordson tractor was tied up because it had a belt pulley on it, and that would tie up where they could have used it otherwise. And Sears Roebuck had a pulley that went on the Model T Ford that cost $2.50, I remember. And I would get that, and I'd build that up so that I could throw it over. And of course, I had a milling machine, so I could make different transmissions and so on. And I don't know how, I made a bunch of those. And that went over well. That was really on my own. My dad helped me with it, sure, initially. But then I was always modifying them, trying to make them a little better. Yeah.
Was it the Sears catalog, or did you guys go to Sears?
No, it was Sears catalog. $2.50, I remember. Boy, I had to work to get the $2.50.
What did your father give you advice as a kid that gave you values or about right and wrong?
He did. He gave me values. You know, the only time I can remember my daddy was really got mad at me And we had what was called a little house. It was the first house on the, well, it was probably 200 years old, and we'd had to put a roof on, a shingle roof, every few years. And of course you had your studs going across, and you put the stanchion to put your wood across on, and you had to get into the studs. And my dad said, well, you get up there and you put this in and make sure those nails are in the studs. Well, I went up there, and of course I didn't put them in the studs. And he and I were up there probably, oh, I'd say maybe 12 feet to the ground, and that thing went off. And we both ended up on the ground. And my dad says, look, if we'd have been up on the barn roof, we'd have been dead. And he really did. He lectured, and that's the only time I can remember him really lecturing on something I did wrong. But we would have. We'd have been killed if it had been up on the barn roof. So I always remembered that.